The grand concert hall shone like a palace that morning. Tall chandeliers hung from the ceiling, sparkling with soft golden light. Rows of glossy black pianos waited on stage, polished until they looked like mirrors. The audience hadn't arrived yet, but backstage, nervous energy filled the air. It was the day of the International Piano Competition, an event that brought together the most talented pianists from around the world. Reporters were already setting up their cameras and contestants were warming up, their fingers gliding over the keys like dancers on a stage. Among them stood a young woman named Elena Torres. She was small, quiet, and dressed very simply. A plain white blouse and an old skirt that had clearly been ironed more times than it had been bought new. Her shoes weren't shiny like the others, and her hands trembled as she held her music sheets close to her chest. She had come from a small countryside town where few people even owned a piano. The one she learned on had been a broken instrument someone was throwing away. Her father had fixed it the best he could, using wood glue and parts from an old chair to hold one of the legs steady. The keys were uneven and 3 of them didn't even work. But to Elena, it was a treasure. That piano had taught her what passion really meant. Backstage, everyone seemed to know one another. Contestants from rich families greeted each other with hugs and confident smiles. They talked about their teachers, their conservatories, and their travels. Elena felt like a stranger among them. Then through the small crowd, a tall man entered the room carrying himself with an air of pride. His name was Victor Damour, and he was known by almost everyone there. He was already famous. A pianist who had won several competitions, played with orchestras, and even appeared on television. People said his fingers moved like lightning, and that his confidence filled every stage he walked onto. Victor sat down at one of the warm-up pianos and started to play a fast piece on just to get attention, it seemed. The melody sparkled sharp and powerful. A few contestants stopped to listen and nodded in admiration. When he finished, he smiled, clearly pleased with himself. Elena, standing near the corner, quietly clapped once. She admired talent even when it came with arrogance. Victor noticed her. He turned his head and gave a small, crooked smile. "You're competing too?" he asked, his voice smooth but slightly mocking. Elena nodded politely. "Yes, I'm number 16. He looked her up and down, his eyes scanning her worn-out shoes and simple clothes. He said with a soft laugh. "You must be very brave." Elena didn't understand at first. "Brave?" she asked gently. He smirked. "To come here and compete with real pianists. That takes courage." A few others nearby chuckled awkwardly. Someone whispered something Elena couldn't catch, but she knew it wasn't kind. Her face turned slightly red, and she lowered her eyes to the floor. Victor leaned closer, lowering his voice but making sure others could hear. "I hope your piano at home at least has all the keys working," he said. That made the group laugh more openly. Elena stayed silent. She didn't want to respond with anger. That wasn't her way. She simply gave a small smile and said softly, "It doesn't, but it still makes music." For a moment, Victor looked confused, maybe even caught off guard. But then he shrugged and walked away, clearly uninterested in continuing the conversation. Elena stood there quietly, pretending not to care. But inside her heart was heavy. She had come all this way, traveled for hours by train, saved for months to afford the ticket, only to be laughed at before even playing a note. She sat down on a bench near the wall and watched others practice. Their hands moved so easily, their confidence shining. She felt small, almost invisible. But when she looked at the piano, something inside her steadied. She remembered the nights back home when the power went out, and she played by candlelight. She remembered her father sitting beside her, tapping the rhythm softly on the table when a few keys didn't work. "You don't need every note to make music," he would tell her. "You just need heart." Those words stayed with her always. Now, sitting backstage among people who seemed to belong to another world, she closed her eyes and took a slow breath. She wasn't here to prove Victor wrong. She was here to play, the way she always had, with love, not pride. An old woman, one of the event organizers, passed by and noticed Elena sitting alone. "First time competing?" she asked kindly. Elena smiled. "Yes, and probably the last," she said with a nervous laugh. The woman chuckled softly. "Don't be so sure, dear. You never know what the music has planned for you." That small kindness gave Elena a bit of warmth. She thanked her and began to quietly stretch her fingers. Her hands were small, and sometimes she struggled with pieces that required big jumps across the keys. But her teacher back home had told her once, "What your hands can't do, your heart will." Meanwhile, Victor continued to draw attention from everyone in the room. Reporters approached him for quick interviews. He talked proudly about his upcoming album, about how he expected to win again this year. When someone asked if he was nervous about the new contestants, he smiled and said, "Not really. You can usually tell who belongs on stage and who doesn't." Elena heard that. She didn't say anything. She just kept her eyes on her music sheets, reading the notes she had practiced thousands of times. Hours passed slowly. Contestants went up one by one. Some played brilliantly, others made small mistakes. The judges, a row of serious-looking musicians, watched closely, rarely smiling. From backstage, Elena could hear bits of applause after each performance. The sound made her pulse quicken. Her turn was getting closer. Her hands were cold and she rubbed them together for warmth. Then Victor's name was called. The audience clapped as he walked onto the stage with complete confidence, almost like he owned it. From the monitor backstage, Elena could see him bow with a smile before sitting at the piano. He played an intense piece, fast, precise, and technically perfect. The hall filled with thunderous notes, his fingers moving faster than most could follow. He played like a storm, powerful but controlled. When he finished, the crowd erupted in applause. Some even stood up. Elena couldn't help but admire his skill. He really was extraordinary. But even as she listened, she felt something missing, something human. The notes were beautiful, but they didn't speak. They didn't feel. Her number was next. She stood up slowly, her knees trembling. She took a deep breath and looked down at her small hands. "Just play," she whispered to herself. "Just play like you're home." When her name was called, the lights of the stage seemed too bright. Her steps felt heavy as she walked toward the piano. She could hear a few murmurs from the audience, maybe people wondering who she was, or why she looked so nervous. Backstage, Victor watched with crossed arms and a slight smirk. Elena bowed politely, sat down and placed her hands on the keys. For a brief moment she froze. Her reflection on the shiny surface of the piano lid showed a face that looked uncertain, scared even. Then she remembered her father's words again. "You don't need every note to make music." She smiled faintly and pressed the first key. The sound was soft, fragile like a whisper in a quiet room. Then it grew, gently, tenderly. Her fingers moved slowly at first, then began to flow with the melody she knew better than her own heartbeat. The audience leaned in, listening. The noise of whispering stopped. Even the judges seemed to lean slightly forward, curious. Her song was not loud, not flashy, but it was full of life. Full of something that couldn't be taught. Backstage, Victor's smile began to fade. The sound of her first few notes floated softly through the hall, like a gentle breeze on a quiet morning. The audience had been whispering a little when she walked in, but as soon as she started to play, the room slowly fell silent. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from boredom. It was the kind that came from curiosity, from the sense that something unexpected was about to happen. Elena's fingers trembled at first. The opening of her piece, a soft nocturne, demanded delicacy. Every note had to be alive, full of emotion, not just sound. For the first few seconds, her heart raced so fast she could almost hear it louder than the piano itself. But then, something inside her began to calm down. She thought about her home, that tiny living room where she had learned to play. She could almost feel the rough wooden floor under her feet, hear the sound of rain on the roof, and smell her mother's coffee from the kitchen. Her nerves began to fade, and what replaced them was warmth. Her hands moved more freely now, touching the keys like they were telling a story she had carried in her heart for years. The melody began to fill the hall, soft and emotional, each note flowing into the next like a stream of clear water. People in the audience leaned forward, some without realizing it. They had seen many talented pianists that day, people who played with speed and power. But this was something different. There was no pride in her performance, no need to show off. There was only honesty. Backstage, Victor stood with his arms crossed, still wearing that confident smirk from earlier. But after a minute, his smile began to fade. He tilted his head slightly, almost frowning. He had expected a nervous beginner who would stumble and fail, but instead he heard something pure, something that touched even his guarded heart. Elena's left hand played a deep, slow rhythm, while her right hand danced above it with light, airy notes. The sound echoed through the hall, calm yet powerful, fragile yet fearless. The judges exchanged glances. One of them closed his eyes, listening more deeply. For Elena, time disappeared. She wasn't thinking about winning or losing anymore. She wasn't thinking about Victor or the people watching her or the judges waiting to score. She was just playing. She remembered her father sitting beside her when she was little. He used to tap his finger on the broken piano, keeping rhythm because the metronome never worked. She could almost hear his voice saying, "Play with your heart, not your hands." And that's exactly what she did. Each note carried her memories. The sound of her father's laughter, the nights she practiced until her fingers ached, the loneliness of a dream no one in her town understood. All of it came out through the piano, speaking a language words could never describe. In the middle of her piece, something remarkable happened. A small mistake, one soft note slightly off key, slipped out. But instead of panicking, she turned it into part of the music. She made it sound intentional, flowing into the next phrase so naturally that no one even noticed. That tiny moment showed her true artistry, not perfection, but heart. The audience didn't move. No one coughed, no one whispered. Even the cameras that usually clicked during performances seemed to pause. Every ear in the hall was focused on that one piano, and the girl who was making it sing. Her music grew stronger near the end, no longer fragile but glowing with emotion. It was like she had built a bridge from her soul to every person listening, and when she reached the final note, a soft, fading sound that seemed to hover in the air, she kept her fingers on the keys for a few extra seconds, letting the silence breathe. Then she lifted her hands slowly, stood and bowed. For a moment, no one clapped. It wasn't because they didn't like it. It was because they were still lost in what they had just heard. And then, suddenly, the silence broke. A wave of applause filled the hall, louder and louder until it became thunderous. People rose from their seats one after another, cheering and clapping. Some even whistled. The sound was so overwhelming that Elena, who wasn't used to such attention, looked a little confused. She stepped back slightly, eyes wide, her lips trembling between a smile and disbelief. She hadn't expected this, not after the laughter backstage, not after being looked down upon. Backstage, Victor stood still. He clapped slowly at first, then stopped. His face had changed, no more mockery, no more smug confidence. What he had just witnessed had shaken him. He realized something he hadn't felt in years. His performances were always perfect, but they had never touched people like this. He had technique, fame, and reputation, but she had soul. And that made all the difference. Elena walked off the stage, bowing again as the audience continued clapping. Her legs felt weak. She had given everything she had in those few minutes. One of the event staff members met her near the exit and said softly, "That was beautiful." She smiled shyly and whispered, "Thank you." As she stepped backstage, she noticed Victor standing near the wall. For a second, she thought he might say something rude again, but instead he looked away. He seemed lost in thought. Elena sat down on the same wooden bench where she had waited earlier. Her hands were still shaking. Not from fear anymore, but from the emotion of what had just happened. She had never played in front of such a big crowd before, never heard applause like that in her life. A few contestants came to her and congratulated her quietly. One of them said, "I think you just stole the whole show." She smiled but didn't really believe it. She thought they were just being polite. When the final contestants finished, the judges took a short break to decide the results. Everyone in the backstage area was buzzing with talk about Elena's performance. Even people who hadn't watched the whole thing were asking about the girl in the simple blouse who made everyone cry. Victor didn't join in the chatter. He stayed in the corner, leaning against the wall, staring at the floor. A few people tried to talk to him, but he didn't respond much. Something inside him was unsettled. He had played perfectly, yet the only name people were talking about was hers. When the announcement time came, all the contestants gathered on stage again. Elena stood near the back, her hands folded nervously in front of her. The host walked up with a microphone and began announcing the results. Third place went to a contestant from France, applause. Then came the second place, May. When they called Elena's name, the hall burst into cheers again. She was stunned. Her hands went to her mouth. She couldn't believe it. She walked forward slowly, almost afraid she had misheard. The host handed her a silver trophy, and she bowed again, her eyes wet with tears. First place went to another pianist, technically brilliant, deserving in his own way. But everyone knew who had captured the audience's heart that night. Even as the winner smiled for photos, the crowd's eyes kept drifting back to Elena, the girl from a small town with the broken piano. When the ceremony ended, she stepped off the stage holding her trophy close. She wasn't thinking about fame or prizes. All she could think about was calling her father and telling him, "I did it." As she walked toward the exit, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Victor. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there for a moment looking unsure of himself, something very rare for him. Then he said quietly, "Your performance, it was real." Elena turned to him a little surprised. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded slowly. "I was wrong about you." She gave a gentle smile. "It's all right," she replied. "Music isn't about who's better. It's about who listens." Victor didn't know how to respond. He just watched her walk away, holding her small trophy, disappearing into the crowd of people still clapping for her. That night, as she sat in her small hotel room, Elena placed the trophy on the table beside her old sheet music. She looked out the window at the city lights and smiled to herself. She hadn't come to prove anyone wrong. She had come to play, and she had done exactly that. And somewhere deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, sunlight filled the city streets like a golden river. Birds sang softly on the balconies and people hurried past, talking about last night's competition. In cafes, newspapers carried photos from the event, smiling contestants, shiny pianos, and a small picture of a young woman standing with a silver trophy in her hands. Elena woke up early, still half dreaming. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then she saw the trophy on the small hotel table, and it all came rushing back. The music, the stage, the applause, it felt unreal. She got up slowly, her hands brushing against the little silver cup as if to make sure it was really there. The metal was cool against her fingertips, her heart filled with quiet joy. She hadn't expected to win anything. In fact, when she came, she only wanted to play her piece and go home. But now, her name was being whispered by people she had never met before. After breakfast, she walked outside to breathe some fresh air. The city felt different today. Maybe it was her, not the city, that had changed. She passed a small group of students near the music academy. They were talking excitedly, showing each other something on a phone screen. When she got closer, she realized they were watching her performance. She froze for a second, not knowing whether to walk away or say something. Then one of them looked up and said, "Wait, that's her. The girl from last night." They all turned, smiling. One of them said, "That was beautiful. We've never heard anything like that before." Elena blushed and thanked them softly. She didn't know what else to say. Compliments always made her shy. But deep inside, she felt something warm. Not pride, but gratitude. She spent the rest of the morning walking through the quiet streets, stopping by a small park with benches and flowers. She sat there for a while thinking about her journey, the old piano, her father's encouragement, and the long train ride that brought her here. She wished he could have been there to see it. As she sat lost in thought, a tall man in a black coat appeared from the park entrance. It was Victor. His usual confident walk seemed slower today, his expression calm but thoughtful. Elena noticed him right away but looked down politely. She didn't want to make things awkward. He walked closer and stopped near her bench. "Do you mind if I sit?" he asked. She nodded slightly. There was a short silence before he spoke again. "I watched your video online this morning," he said, glancing at the ground. "The comments are full of people saying they cried." Elena smiled faintly. "That's kind of them," she said. He hesitated, then continued. "I didn't expect that from you yesterday. I was wrong to underestimate you." She looked at him, not with anger, but with a gentle curiosity. "It's all right," she said. "People only see what they want to see." Victor sighed. "You played with something I've forgotten. Feeling. I've spent years chasing perfection, counting every note, every beat. But you—" He stopped for a moment, searching for the right words. "You made people feel something." That's what real music is. Elena didn't know how to reply. She just smiled again, a quiet smile that said more than words could. Victor leaned back on the bench, looking up at the sky. You know, he said softly, I started playing when I was 5. My parents pushed me hard. They told me I had to be the best. And for a long time I thought that's what music was about. Trophies, medals, fame. But last night, he paused, shaking his head slightly. You changed that for me. Elena looked down at her hands. I didn't mean to change anyone, she said. I just wanted to play honestly. He nodded. And that honesty showed. For a while, they both sat in silence, listening to the soft sounds of the city, birds, distant traffic, the faint hum of life. It wasn't an awkward silence. It felt peaceful, like two people who finally understood something unspoken. After a few minutes, Victor stood up. There's going to be a charity concert next month, he said. It's for young musicians. Maybe you'd like to join? They'd be lucky to have you. Elena's eyes widened. Me in a concert with professionals? Victor smiled a little. You are a professional now, whether you believe it or not. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. If they'll have me, I'd be honored. Good, he said with a lighter tone. Then it settled. As he walked away, he turned back once more. By the way, he added, don't ever stop playing like that. Don't lose what makes you special. Elena watched him go, his figure disappearing into the bright sunlight. She sat there for a long while afterward, thinking about his words. The weeks that followed passed like a dream. Messages started pouring in online from people around the world, strangers who said her music had touched their hearts. A few even shared stories of their own struggles, telling her that her performance had inspired them not to give up on their dreams. Elena read every message carefully, often with tears in her eyes. She couldn't believe that her music, something born in a quiet little house far away, could travel so far and reach so many souls. One day, she received an email from a well-known music director. He had seen her performance online and wanted to offer her a scholarship at a prestigious conservatory. She read the message 3 times to make sure she wasn't imagining it. When she called home to tell her father, he cried on the phone. I told you, he said through tears. You don't need a perfect piano to make perfect music. Elena laughed and wiped her own tears. You were right, Papa. You always were. The next month came quickly. The charity concert was held in the same grand hall where she had once been laughed at. This time, though, things felt different. The organizers greeted her warmly. Reporters wanted to interview her. And when she walked backstage, even Victor smiled. A real smile, not the proud one he used to wear. You ready? He asked. She nodded. More than ever. They performed a duet that evening, a beautiful emotional piece that told a story without words. Their hands moved together across the piano, their sounds blending perfectly. The audience could feel the harmony between them, not just in music, but in spirit. When the final note faded, the hall exploded in applause again. But this time it wasn't about competition. It was about connection. Victor turned to her and said quietly, You taught me something no teacher ever could. Elena smiled. And you reminded me that even the proudest hearts can still listen. The applause went on, echoing through the hall like waves of gratitude. That night, after the concert, Elena stepped outside the hall, holding a single white rose someone from the audience had given her. She looked up at the night sky full of stars and took a deep breath. The city lights twinkled like tiny reflections of her dreams, dreams that had once seemed too far to reach. She wasn't rich, she wasn't famous, and she didn't have a grand piano waiting for her at home. But she had something far greater, a heart full of music, and the courage to share it. Somewhere in the distance, she could almost hear her father's voice again, proud and full of warmth. Play with your heart, not your hands, she smiled, whispering into the cool night air. I always will. And with that, she began walking toward the future. One note, one song, one heartbeat at a time. After the charity concert, Elena's life began to change in ways she had never imagined. Her name started to appear in newspapers and on small television programs. People called her the pianist with the golden heart. Videos of her performance were shared everywhere. Comments poured in from people around the world, not just musicians, but ordinary people who said her music made them feel something deep inside. But even as her fame grew, Elena remained the same quiet, humble person she had always been. She still preferred simple clothes and gentle smiles over fancy dresses and big speeches. She didn't play to impress. She played to express. That's what made her different. The conservatory that had offered her a scholarship officially invited her to begin her studies in the fall. It was one of the best in Europe, a dream place for any musician. When she received the letter, she pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. She thought of her father and her little town, how she had started with a broken piano and a hope that refused to die. The days leading up to her move were filled with mixed emotions. Excitement, nervousness, a little bit of fear. She packed her few belongings carefully, including her old sheet music, the trophy, and a framed photo of her father smiling beside their patched-up piano. Before leaving, she visited the small school where she used to teach children basic music lessons. The kids ran to her laughing, shouting her name. "Teacher, we saw you on the internet," one boy said. "You were amazing." She smiled and hugged them, her heart full. "Promise me something," she said softly. "Always play for love, not for prizes." They all nodded, not fully understanding the depth of her words yet. But one day, they would. When she arrived in the new city, everything felt big and new. The conservatory building looked like something out of a dream. Tall windows, long corridors filled with the sound of pianos, violins and voices practicing all day. At first, she felt small again, just like she had at the international competition, but soon she found her rhythm. Her teachers were amazed by how she played, not only with skill but with emotion. She had a way of making every note sound like a story. Sometimes after class, she would sit by the window in the practice room, watching the sunset and remembering how far she had come. Meanwhile, Victor's life was changing too. The charity concert had opened his eyes. For years he had lived inside a bubble of pride, always chasing perfection, always judging others by how polished they looked or how fast they could play. But that night, playing alongside Elena, he had felt something different, something real. He started to look at music differently. He began to volunteer at small schools, teaching children from poor families who couldn't afford lessons. At first, people were surprised. They couldn't believe that the proud, competitive Victor was spending his time helping beginners. But he smiled and said, "They remind me what music truly means." Every now and then, he would message Elena, asking how her studies were going. She would reply politely, always thankful but never boastful. Their friendship grew quietly, built not on competition but on respect. Months passed. Elena practiced day and night at the conservatory. There were moments of struggle, tough exams, long nights, and days when her hands ached from hours of practice. Sometimes she doubted herself again, especially when surrounded by students from rich families with perfect instruments and years of private training. But whenever doubt crept in, she remembered that moment on the big stage, the silence before the applause, the feeling of connection she had with the audience. That memory gave her strength. One evening, while she was practicing alone, the door of her room opened slightly. A teacher stepped inside, a well-known pianist who had been watching her progress. He said, "Elena, there's someone who wants to meet you." She followed him to the main hall. There, standing beside the grand piano, was the same music director who had first noticed her after the competition. He smiled warmly. "I have a proposal for you," he said. "There's a concert in Vienna next month, a showcase of young talents. I'd like you to perform." Her heart skipped a beat. Vienna, the city of classical music where legends had played. It was every pianist's dream to perform there. She stammered, Me? Are you sure?" He chuckled. "Of course. I'm sure. You have something special, something audiences remember long after the concert ends." She didn't know what to say except, "Thank you. I'll do my best." The next few weeks were filled with preparation. She practiced every morning before classes and every night after dinner. She chose a new piece, one that was both emotional and challenging. It told a story of struggle and hope, a reflection of her own life. On the day of the concert, the hall in Vienna glowed with golden light. The audience was filled with musicians, critics, and fans. Elena stood backstage, her hands shaking slightly, just like that first competition. But this time the fear didn't feel heavy. It felt alive, a reminder that she cared deeply about what she was doing. Victor was there too, He had flown in to watch her performance. He greeted her with a kind smile. "Remember," he said, "don't chase perfection. Chase feeling." She nodded, smiling back. "That's what I always do." When her name was announced, she walked onto the stage. The applause was polite but distant. People didn't know her yet. They didn't expect much. But as soon as she began to play, the air in the room changed. Her fingers moved gracefully across the keys, each note rising like a heartbeat, full of emotion and truth. The audience grew silent, drawn in by the sincerity of her sound. Even the critics who had come ready to analyze every detail forgot to take notes. She played with her whole heart. It wasn't about fame or approval. It was about sharing something real. By the time she finished, the hall was completely still, just like before. Then came the applause, loud and heartfelt. People stood up, cheering, wiping tears from their eyes. Among them, Victor clapped the hardest, smiling with pride. He knew what it meant to reach people like that. After the concert, several musicians came to congratulate her. One of them said, "You didn't just play, you spoke through the piano." Elena thanked them all humbly, her heart overflowing with gratitude. That night, back in her hotel room, she sat by the window again, looking at the city lights. She thought about how life had changed, not suddenly but step by step. From a small broken piano to one of the biggest stages in the world, from being laughed at to being celebrated. But what made her happiest wasn't the applause or the praise. It was knowing that somewhere out there maybe a little girl was watching her and believing, "If she can do it, so can I." Meanwhile, Victor returned home inspired. He continued his teaching and started a foundation to support young artists who couldn't afford instruments. He even named it the Heart of Music, a quiet tribute to the girl who had once taught him humility. In interviews, when people asked him about his transformation, he always said the same thing. Perfection can impress people, but honesty, that moves them. Elena and Victor's paths crossed again many times after that, at concerts, events, and festivals. They often shared the stage not as rivals, but as partners who respected each other deeply. Every time they played together, audiences could feel that connection, the balance of power and softness, pride and humility all blending into one sound. Years later, when people talked about the night the proud pianist scoffed at a simple girl, they didn't speak of arrogance anymore. They spoke of change, of redemption, and of how one performance changed two lives forever. And Elena, wherever she went, carried her father's old saying like a melody that never faded. Play with your heart, not your hands. She lived by it, and through her, so did everyone who listened. Years passed like pages of a quiet song, each one carrying new melodies and moments for Elena. Her life had changed in so many ways that sometimes she hardly recognized it herself. But through it all, she stayed grounded, the same gentle soul who once sat by an old piano in a small town, dreaming of music. She had now become one of the most loved pianists of her generation. Concert halls filled up wherever her name appeared on posters. Her soft-spoken nature and her way of playing straight from the heart made people adore her. She didn't just play, she told stories through music. Stories that made listeners smile, cry, and remember the feelings they'd hidden for years. Despite her success, she never let fame take her away from who she really was. She still wrote letters to her father every week. She still visited her hometown every summer. And she still kept that old photo of her father beside their broken piano on her desk, a reminder of where it all began. One quiet evening, after finishing a rehearsal in Paris, she received an invitation that took her by surprise. It was from the organizers of the very same international competition where she had once been laughed at. The message said they wanted her to return, this time not as a contestant but as a guest performer and honorary judge. She held the letter in her hands for a long time, her eyes filling with emotion. That stage had once made her feel so small, so uncertain, and now they were asking her to return as someone who had inspired countless others. When the day of the event arrived, she stood backstage again, the same hall, the same golden chandeliers, but an entirely different feeling in her heart. Contestants rushed around, warming up and checking their sheet music, just like she had done years ago. Some of them recognized her and whispered to each other in awe, but she didn't stand tall out of pride. She stood quietly, smiling, offering encouragement to the nervous young musicians who passed by. As she looked around, her eyes landed on a familiar face in the distance. Victor. Time had softened him. He still carried the same calm confidence, but his eyes were warmer now, full of peace rather than pride. He walked toward her with a smile that reached his eyes. "It feels strange to be here again, doesn't it?" he said. Elena nodded, smiling softly. Yes, like a memory playing itself again, but with a different tune. He laughed gently. "Do you remember how we met?" "I do," she said. "You laughed at me." He smiled, a little embarrassed. "Yes, and you played better than I ever had." "I'll never forget that." They both chuckled, not with bitterness but with shared understanding. That evening, the hall was filled to its last seat. The audience buzzed with excitement. The competition had grown even bigger over the years, and having Elena and Victor perform together again was the highlight of the event. Before going on stage, Elena peeked through the curtain and looked at the sea of faces. She saw young pianists sitting in the front rows, their eyes filled with dreams, the same dreams she once carried. She whispered to herself, "This is for them." When the lights dimmed and her name was announced, the hall erupted with applause. She walked out gracefully, wearing a simple dress and that same calm smile. Victor followed behind her, bowing to the audience. They sat down at the grand piano side by side. The crowd went silent. Then together they began to play. The piece they chose wasn't about speed or difficulty. It was about emotion, a duet they had written together, blending their two stories into one. His bold, precise notes met her gentle, heartfelt ones, creating a balance that filled the hall like a living heartbeat. As the music grew, people could almost feel their journey through every note, the pride that once stood between them, the humility that replaced it, the lessons learned, and the friendship that grew from it. It was more than a performance. It was a message. When the last note faded into silence, the audience stood as one. The applause was thunderous, echoing off the walls. Some people were crying. Some were smiling through tears. Victor turned to Elena and whispered, "We did it?" She smiled softly. "No," she said. "We lived it." After the performance, the organizers invited her to speak for a few minutes. She walked up to the microphone, still a little shy in front of such a big crowd. She looked around at the young faces and said gently, "When I first came here years ago, I was scared. I felt out of place. I thought I didn't belong. But I learned something important that day. Music doesn't care where you come from. It doesn't care about your clothes, your money, or your fame. It only cares about your heart." The hall was completely silent, every word sinking deep. She continued, "Someone once laughed at me and I almost gave up. But I'm glad I didn't. Because every struggle, every doubt, every broken key on that old piano taught me something valuable. If you love your art, whatever it is, then keep going. Because one day your music will speak louder than words." The crowd stood again, clapping endlessly. After the event, reporters wanted interviews, photos, and quotes. But Elena stayed only as long as she needed to. She didn't enjoy the spotlight much. What she loved most was when a young girl approached her shyly and said, "I want to play like you someday." Elena knelt down, smiled, and said, "Don't play like me. Play like you. That's how you'll find your magic." The girl's eyes sparkled. "Okay," she said softly. Later that night, when the hall was empty and quiet, Elena walked alone onto the stage once more. The lights were dim now, the seats empty. She ran her hand gently over the piano keys, feeling their smooth surface under her fingers. Victor walked up behind her. "Couldn't leave without saying goodbye to the piano?" he asked with a grin. She smiled. "It's funny," she said, "this piano saw me cry once. And now it's seen me heal." He nodded, his eyes soft. "You changed my life, you know. I was too proud to admit it before, but you did. You made me listen differently, us not just to music, but to people." She looked at him and said, "Maybe that's what music is for, to help us listen." They stood in silence for a while, side by side, the empty hall surrounding them like an old friend. Then Victor turned to her and said, "I'm thinking of retiring soon. But before I do, I want us to play one last concert together. Not for fame, not for money, but for children who can't afford instruments. Would you join me?" Elena smiled, her eyes bright. "Of course. That's the kind of music worth playing." And so, months later, they did. The concert was held outdoors under an open sky, surrounded by children from small towns and schools. There were no expensive lights, no fancy decorations, just laughter, clapping, and music. Elena played her favorite piece, the same one she had performed years ago when the world first saw her. This time, though, her hands didn't shake. They danced. The children sat cross-legged on the ground, watching her fingers move, their eyes wide with wonder. Some of them had never seen a real piano before. When she finished, she looked at them and said softly, "Remember, the music is not in the piano. It's in you." The crowd clapped joyfully, and the sound of their laughter filled the air like sunlight. As the night grew darker, Elena sat quietly, looking up at the stars. The sound of music still echoed faintly around her, not from her piano, but from the hearts of the children humming the tune she had just played. Victor came and sat beside her. "You know," he said, "one day they'll tell your story in this very hall, the story of the girl who taught the world how to feel again." She smiled, looking at the stars. "If they remember anything," she said, "I hope it's not my name. I hope they remember the music." And with that, the two of them sat together in peaceful silence, two souls who had once stood on opposite sides of pride and now shared the same melody. The wind moved softly through the trees. Somewhere far away, a piano played faintly, maybe from a home, maybe from a dream. And in that sound lived the heart of Elena's story, a story of kindness, humility, and the power of music that began with a single broken piano and a girl who refused to stop playing.